Hi, my name is Alex Williams, founder of THENEWSTACK, and you're listening to the Stack Analysts podcast, a show about application development and management at scale. Thanks for joining us. Hey, it's Alex Williams, THENEWSTACK, here for a special report of THENEWSTACK Analysts. It is just 2 days since we wrote about a potential Docker fork, and really, if anything else, and just something that's going to happen inside the Docker ecosystem, container ecosystem. We're not sure what it is. It could be something that comes out of OCI, but it seems worthy of discussion right now. And so I brought some folks together who, I think can add some perspective, not just about this issue, but kind of general topics related to open source communities and open source foundations, and kind of the history of forks and what they mean and what they can do, and from a healthy perspective, what can go well and inevitably sometimes what can go wrong. So I'd like to introduce the people I have here today. Job Jackson, managing editor of THENEWSTACK. Donnie Burkholz, a longtime co-anchor for the THENEWSTACK Analysts, was here since the very start. And we have Diane Mueller of Red Hat. Hey guys, how are you?
Doing well.
Great. So why don't we just start? Job, maybe you could just give us kind of a background on where we are right now, and then we can start kind of moving into some of the discussions related to what's happening in Docker container ecosystem. I know that Donnie has some perspectives that he's like to bring in based on some, recent analysis of forks, and I know Diane is very interested in foundations and their role. And so, but Job, can you just help us get started?
Well, sure. Well, we first came across this story late last week while talking with people at LinuxCon about a meeting or possible series of meetings taking place amongst technical, I guess, the container groups of companies, the number of companies, with the, the stated purpose of talking about what to do about Docker, and with the possibility of forking off the software. Now, the initial set of names revolved around Google, Red Hat, CoreOS, and maybe a couple of others. Now, there's always been a certain amount of grumbling about Docker and its release schedule. As any incumbent, there's going to be disagreements on how things are done. But a large number of the people supposedly in these talks, which were supposedly held in New York, revolve around the Kubernetes community, either as a reseller of Kubernetes or involved in the project in some sort of way. So we wrote that up, and we discussed the various, misgivings that people have had about particularly around Docker's aggressive release schedule, and the conflict that this is coming in terms of having stable software ready for the enterprise. And again, this to date has been a lot of grumbling, so we don't really have any specifics about any talks or the specific path going forward from the talks, but it certainly has created a lot of discussion about what would happen if the Docker codebase were to be forked.
Donnie, what's your take on these recent events? What's your analysis of it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's been a lot of changes in Docker over the past year, as you've got to reconcile the needs of a community using containers with the needs of a company that's taken a bunch of venture funding, and that has an imperative to create a business model that's functional around it. And they've had to compete with their own ecosystem in many ways. to move up the stack, right? Starting from Docker itself up to the orchestration layer and up into the management layer. And they've had to race to keep up because as they've been dedicating a lot of their effort to innovating to Docker itself, they've had this big community of people both working in parallel to them and on top of them, trying to add value, like Kubernetes, like Mesos, and like many others. And so, that from their perspective, they've got a lot of commercial drivers to make sure that they can, stay as competitive as possible and figure out how they can, make enough money to pay back their investors in the long term. And one of the things that happened recently was, putting swarm mode into Docker 112, which they announced back at DockerCon a couple months ago. And the way I see that from, I guess, an analysis perspective is that the power of defaults is enormous. And Docker's philosophy all along has been batteries included but switchable, right? The problem is, if the included batteries work, it really lowers the driving force to switch to anything else. It's kind of like, if you go buy a new toy at the toy store and it comes with some brand of batteries you've never heard of, well, it turns out they still power the toy. And so, unless you really like that Energizer or Duracell, you'll probably use the ones that come with it until they run out of power. And so, I think that power being built in is very incredible. And it has a lot to do with the reason that they have put Swarm mode directly into Docker itself, rather than Docker Swarm being a separate add-on that was the only way to do that from the Docker Inc. perspective.
That perspective on batteries work, but it actually makes me think, have I ever replaced one set of batteries for another in a device I have? I don't think I ever have. I replace them when they run out, and then I don't care if it's a Radio Shack battery or a Duracell battery.
Well, I'd disagree with that. Like when I go out to buy batteries, I'll buy the ones that are the rechargeable ones after the first ones wear out, and the ones that are easily reusable. So there are benefits to different kinds of batteries. In the case of the containers and the Docker universe that Docker has created, they've done a huge and wonderful thing making containers so universal, and kudos to them for doing it. I think there's a lot of pluses for having it being driven by an individual organization such as Docker and Solomon's leadership. It sort of brings us to the model for an open source project, and the conversations around whether you need a benevolent dictator, and the whole conversation around forking it. And I must say, your blog post was the first I heard of any cabal of people meeting in New York to discuss possibly forking Docker. So I had not heard any, or was not privy to any conversations around that, either at Red Hat or at LinuxCon. So I missed it until you blogged about it, and I have no corroboration for those conversations. But I actually think that the idea of forking any major project like this brings up a lot of issues for keeping the community together and keeping us to having these universal batteries that Docker has so nicely helped drive the development of. And that would be my concern with forking anything at this point. The universality of the Docker container and the ability to use it was what drove the creation of the OCI, the Open Container Initiative, and that foundation to start creating some standardization around runC and Rocket and the other projects, so that all of the different Mesos and Kubernetes and everyone else had the same, shall we say, batteries or containers to work with and to deploy. So I think my concern with the forking is, if it's true, and if somebody wants to do that, ultimately communities lose when the forking happens, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there are always a lot of concerns around, fragmenting communities, and whether, if a fork happens, if that just means, it's worse for everybody, right? Rather than either side winning, instead both sides go downhill from there. And so there's always a lot of concerns around that, and around, if you say, hey, we're going to go do this thing, well, who's really going to contribute to it, right? It's easy to have speculations on Twitter. It's still pretty easy to get together in person and have a meeting about what this could look like at the early stages. But there's a lot of work that happens between the point of saying, yeah, I think we should do this, to actually making it happen, right? To building up, whether it's a cabal or a coalition or whatever it happens to be, building up enough momentum to say this is something we really need to happen. And, typically, I mean, the thing that's interesting about this conversation is that there is, a significant difference in direction being suggested for, what Docker is doing itself right now as an open source project compared to the proposed direction of this theoretical fork, right? Which is optimizing for stable enterprise core rather than for, fast moving agile, let's get more features in as fast as possible and get that out the door. And that, I think is a hallmark of any fork where both of them do survive, is there is some real difference in philosophy and differentiation that cannot be reconciled between those two groups. And that brings me to one thing I wanted to discuss here, which Alex alluded to earlier on. There's an academic paper from a few years back where they looked into what happened with open source software forks, and they dug up 220 forks that happened, and looked at, hey, what happened down the road of these forks? Which one died? Which one succeeded? Which one failed? And it was pretty interesting because the results were not exactly what I expected at all. Having been around the open source community for quite a while at this point, in that I'll just kind of run through what happened here in order. So it was 44% was successful branching. So both of them survived in almost half the cases. And typically that happened when there was some real difference in philosophy that gave both of them a meaningful use case for existence, right? Not just saying, hey, we can't get along with these people, but we do have a difference in direction. And there's a certain community of users and customers that needs both of those directions. So that was 44%. 30% of the time, the original died. But the important caveat is 2/3 of those were because the original was dying anyways. Right, with one of the classic examples being, Apache came about because of the old NCSA HTTPD server, right, which was already at the point where it was either on life support or dead at the time. And so in only 10% of the cases did the original die after the fork, right? And so you've got that 10% the original died, you got 45% of the time almost, they both survive. And the next one was you got 14% of the time the fork died, right? So the new one died. And so, it's roughly equivalent, a small, minority of the time, one or the other dies. And then 10% of the time, 9% of the time, both of them died. Right? And so if you put that together, you get something on the order of 35% of the time, at least one of them fails to survive, which is a significant risk for, some of the parties involved in that. But on the flip side of that, you got about 45% of the time, they both survive. And so, you got to balance the risks against the benefits, just like any other major decision to decide, whether this is a worthwhile thing and whether, you have a chance to survive. Because I think, nobody's got any major hostility against Docker because they're a company, they've got to survive, they got to do their thing, and that's fine. And it's just about finding the right path for, all the interests involved going forward. And whether that's, reconciling it in the current form, or whether you have to sort of, take the nuclear step. The point is, if you look at the research, things tend to work out reasonably well, even if you do have to pull the trigger on that.
Well, and also, it begs the question is the role of the OCI, as a foundation, are they going to be able to tap in to create that enterprise standard core for Docker and for containers? And is there enough momentum there and enough goodwill to make that happen? And I would rather than forking, I would rather see people spend their energies making, and this is Diane saying this about a foundation, that we should spend a little bit more time focusing and putting more resources on OCI and getting the work done there. And that probably could prevent a fork completely.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of at what level does a fork need to happen, right? Because if you have a common shared core, anybody can build upon that in any way they want to. And so then it's, not quite a fork in the same way as like, it was a year and a half ago when Rocket came out. And everybody at the time was talking about it as if it were a fork, which it wasn't. I mean, it was a fork in terms of, I guess, the community in a way, but it wasn't a fork of the software.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing here. It's like, I've worked on lots of open source projects, some with benevolent dictators, some run by committees, all with lots of different governance models. And, you know, our first passion was to not fork, but I have worked on projects like Cloud Foundry ages ago, and worked at Active State where we did a fork of Cloud Foundry in the early days so that we could make it support different things that our customer base wanted to use. And, you know, the politics that were involved in working through those forks and getting pull requests in were kind of what nudged us to make that fork. So there hasn't been sort of the same similar, I won't take your pull request. There's been some pull requests that from Red Hat, I'm sure that we would like to get into Docker, but it hasn't been sort of that same level of blocking. And so I still think there's a lot of breathing room to work together and to get these things in and maybe find a common core that actually works and that OCI can support.
So the heart of the issue, what is it, Joe? We've, you know, from the way we've been able to gather, there's a few dynamics here. First of all, it's like Docker Swarm getting integrated into 1.12. But, you know, I don't know if that's an outlier or not. There's also, you know, people say that Docker breaks a lot because they do update it so much, and they treat it more as a product than a component. So they are, so they're basically trying to use, you know, they're using, you know, the Docker engine as a way to, you know, innovate and to, as, you know, as Donnie maintains, helping their investors get the most out of their money. So what is it? You know, what is it that's driving this?
Well, I mean, you can also flip the question around too as well. And who are the people who are calling for this, and what are the reasons they have for needing to have this fork take place? So I just throw that out there. It does happen at a very precarious time too. I know our research guy, Lawrence Heck, a month back, had found that adoption of containers within production are starting to plateau a bit. And, perhaps not incidentally, this is the week of VMware. And there's companies like VMware and there's companies like Chef who offer alternative scenarios to containers where you could have a similar sort of CI/CD automated workflow. I'm not suggesting that VMware or Chef has anything to do with this, but there are alternatives to containers. And talk of a fork at this point, it does not bode well for, for interfacing with the CTOs who have to make decisions about what technologies to choose down the road.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point you make about the executives because, I just was talking to a financial services company this morning, and one of the big pieces of that conversation in every technology choice is risk. What is the risk going to be of doing this? What are security concerns? Just all the classic stuff that it has been for years and years. And, this kind of talk about the possibility of a fork is just another class of risk. And so they're going to say, all right, well, so if the software is, in testing mode, that's one level of risk. If the community is a concern, that's another level of risk. And, how many levels of that can an organization account before they decide, hey, this is something we've got to hold off on? And, our own research kind of bears that out too at 451 in terms of, there's a little bit of a plateau happening of containerized apps getting into production. The interesting thing we're starting to see is, a lot of the companies that were at the sort of investigation phase are now deciding basically they're not ready yet. Whether they're missing expertise, whether they're not seeing the value prop for containers one way or the other, they're starting to run into some kind of wall, and they're starting to settle out and say, hey, this isn't quite the time for us yet. And, this is one of many possible reasons for why that could be happening. They're basically saying, hey, we've got to sit back and wait for this stuff to ripen before it's ready for us, right? Before it's ready to, bet some kind of a core trading application on, although, they may go play with it for web apps and what else.
Well, it almost sounds like we're hitting some moment in the Gartner hype cycle too. So what is it, the plateau of productivity or the hiccup of disappointment and disillusion?
Yep.
I'm not quite sure where we're at. We'll have to wait for the next Gartner hype cycle to come out, and nobody believes them anyways anymore. But it just feels like we're at a moment in time that is a natural moment in a lot of open source projects, especially ones that have gotten off to such a good start as Docker has, and that there will always, in almost every project, become a point where, you know, the cabal or the group of leaders contributing to it have a scuffle about who is going to be the benevolent dictator, who's going to drive the release cycles. And that's where companies, and like mine at Red Hat, where we do things like make forks that we apply our own patches to and distribute those, so that there is that stability and maturity in the release cycle. And that's part of, I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about Docker, you know, what is it, a project or a product? It's a product for Docker. It's a product for Red Hat. It's a product for CoreOS and Tectonic and, you know, other folks. This is a product that's being used and marketed by different people, and some people are a lot more successful in how they market themselves as Docker. But I don't think it is, I think there's a lot of FUD going on, especially that's being fed into by some of the folks on Twitter that you quoted so nicely. And though they are, like Greg McCluskey and Kelsey and other folks are definitely thought leaders and people we listen to, so they should be seen as warning signals or flags. But I think they're flags of something that's a natural occurrence in an open source community like this. We've got a lot of wonderful male egos wandering about, and this is a natural thing to happen. Do they figure it out like the Python and Django communities have in the past, or Drupal? Or is this the next, you know, Linux? You know, are we creating, you know, a community that's going to be long lasting? I don't know. I wouldn't bet my house that you know, this form of containers is going to be, we're going to be calling Docker containers this in two, even 3 years. Because I've been doing PaaS now for 3.5, 4 years, and I went from Red Hat, from Cloud Foundry to Red Hat's OpenShift, and we were having gears and cartridges. So LXC containers I was talking about originally, and now we're talking about Docker ones, and this is all in the span of less than 4 years. So, I think containers will continue to evolve, and that hopefully OCI will help create the standards for them. But I don't see this as a crisis point or a huge risk of community point yet. Talk to me in another 6 months.
No, I mean, you have a valid point, right? Like there are a lot of, let's say male egos, right? In most cases, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's any women involved in this decision-making process. I think there are a few. There's
definitely a few really good ones working on it, but probably not at the leadership level, I would say.
Yeah,
right.
That's an issue, a big consideration.
Right. But, what you see in a lot of these open source software projects is, there's a lot of highly opinionated vocal people who aren't afraid to talk about the direction they think things should go, and who argue, both privately and publicly about it. And, in many cases, if they don't get their way, they're just going to turn around and move on with their lives. Right. But all you can do at this point is kind of, hold up threats in the air and say, hey, what, this might happen if we don't stabilize Docker or whatever. And whether it will happen, that's a question of, whether you want to think about it as calling their bluff or not. Most people aren't going to take that real step of creating a standalone project. They're going to say, oh, well, hey, I argued, I did everything I could. I didn't get my way. Now, hey, we're going to move on to the next thing. And we're going to, again, fight for our way, both because of personal beliefs and because of, the companies backing us have economic requirements to try and get something to more closely fit the way they think about it, right? So, for example, take Red Hat, right? If you didn't have to spend as much time and effort stabilizing Kubernetes or stabilizing Docker, then you could increase your margin selling it. But at the same time, it is a business model of providing the stable version. And so, there's interests all around, and everybody's, some combination of personal opinion and the company behind them.
Yeah. Well, I also think there's, Kubernetes and Docker are two apples and oranges. And Kubernetes is a large orchestration project that actually we upstream into OpenShift, and Red Hat's done a lot of work on it, and there's been a very good give and take. We don't have a patched version of Kubernetes. We just upstream it and add our stuff on top of it, which is not quite the same as what we have to do with Docker. So I think, but Kubernetes is young too. So, let's see what the Cloud Native, Computing Foundation can do to manage and mitigate, this. I would predict that this sort of conversation, maybe we're at 1 year, just over 1 year with Kubernetes. Maybe when we hit the 3-year mark or the 2-year mark, we'll have some sort of conflagration. But I think that that Docker is at a different point in its evolution too, and it's used in many other projects and by many other services. So there's a lot more riding on Dockers being the interchangeable batteries that we want for this part of the technology, because it's only one piece of the technologies. That my vision or my dream for something like OpenShift or any of the container applications platforms is that they should be able to service any kind of container, whether it's a Docker image, a Rocket image, a runc based image, that we should, when someone uploads it and wants to deploy it, Kubernetes should be able to handle that. So there may come a time where there are multiple container image formats out there, as long as they have a common core, like OCI is pushing for. We should be able to just use them.
But Donnie, it doesn't seem like Docker is interested as much as OCI as they said they were going to be back when they first, agreed to join the group and made their own technology donations to the organization. And so I'm curious what you think, just looking at the patterns that Docker has followed, and and what are their options right now, and do we expect them to change at all?
Oh yeah, I mean, people over there are very clearly paying a lot of attention to what's being talked about out here. However much reality is behind it, it's when you've got partners and when you've got customers, when you got contributors who are concerned about something, you've got to listen, and you may or may not take action on it, but at least you're listening, and then you can, decide how much merit there is behind it, and try and move the needle in the direction that makes the most sense for you and your community. That is probably not going to be major changes, but they'll probably make some steps in the right direction, because nobody out here is like actively trying to be evil. I don't think. We're all trying to do the right thing. It's just that we have a different perspective on what the right thing is. Mm-hmm. And I guess from an OCI angle, Docker's still doing a lot of talking about runc and that sort of thing, and I'd love to see things like OCI move a little bit higher up the stack. I mean, Docker has a Containerd project that I haven't heard a whole lot of news about for a while here. But it'd be very interesting to think about the potential role of orchestration as a standard, and a standard with implementations, something that we could agree upon. But most of the orchestration tools aren't yet at the level of being consumed by a lot of other software on top of them to drive the need for that standard. And so as we get more and more conservative enterprises, conservative vendors getting into the game, there's going to be a lot more pressure to focus on standards, because that's the kind of thing they ask for.
And you're going to see it as we get more and more enterprise customers and government agencies and other people who want to mitigate their risk. They're going to put pressure on the communities to standardize, so that they'll be able to switch back and forth as they need to. So it is all about the risk, I think, for most of the customers and most of the end users. And this conversation we're having about we're going to fork the whole thing is really I think a lot of FUD at the moment, and that it will get worked out.
I guess in terms of just finishing up here, I'm like to kind of talk a little bit about the role of the foundations here in all this. And Diane, I'm curious on your perspectives about this. You have been thinking a lot about this topic, and I'm curious on your analysis of where we are right now in the Docker and container ecosystem, and and the role of foundations.
Yeah. So what you're alluding to is my rant previously about foundations being the new cathedrals, kind of a riff on the cathedral and bazaar metaphor. And I think we have a risk of, if we created if Docker created a foundation, maybe one of the solutions for doing all this was to create not OCI, but to go off and create, like Cloud Foundry did, a foundation. There would be a risk that it would be a pay-to-play foundation, like the Cloud Foundry one. It wouldn't. Right now, Docker is a huge and vibrant community. Lots of individual contributors, lots of large organizations like Red Hat and others contributing to that. And in my humble opinion, not Red Hat's, I would think that would do more harm to the community than help. OCI as a foundation for creating standards, I think it's seriously under-resourced. I'd like to see more people working on it, and that I think might be a problem. That's that they're not getting enough work, not enough engineering work done, and that needs to be more people working on it and working together on it and collaborating. So that there's like a whole range of issues around foundations. But the one that I alluded to in my earlier rant is that once they get created, often it's hard for the individual to continue to contribute. And that would be a great shame in the Docker community.
So I guess my last question, I don't know if Joe has any last questions. Why are these big companies getting so worked up about this? I mean, and what I'm trying to get, obviously containers have gained such considerable interest. But what are the dynamics here behind that, Donnie? I mean, what do you read out of this when you see, really large companies getting this concerned about things, actually have these kinds of discussions?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different points to discuss there. One is, it's one person doesn't always represent the view of an entire company. Companies are, notoriously fickle beasts that sort of swing with the whims of the market, and different parts of those companies have conflicting opinions about what needs to happen, right? I mean, I bet if you went to, the open source Linux distro side of things at Red Hat, you get a very different answer talking about what needs to happen with Docker and its governance compared to talking to the folks over, in the OpenShift side of things. And so, I think it's important to realize that even if these discussions are happening and they're at an early stage, if people like Diane, for example, haven't been in the loop on them, they're probably not something where they're at a very far down the road yet, right? There'd be a lot of work to happen, a lot of discussions to have before you decide to do anything like that. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Another thing, I think it always comes back to, in many cases for companies, to control, right? And everybody wants something to happen that's in their best interests. And if you've been having trouble making that work, you're always going to sort of throw around possible alternatives for, is there anything we could do to, influence this open source software to move more in the direction we need to go and less in the direction that our competitors needed to go, right? So actively trying to block things against your competitors is something that does occasionally happen in open source software projects and standards bodies and all that sorts of stuff. It's not something you hear a lot about. It's kind of brushed under the covers, but, one example would be, not from a corporate perspective, would be, we heard a while back about how the NSA was, what's the right word for it? Kind of screwing up some of the cryptographic standards, right? Making them easily hackable, which came out in the past year or so. And so these kinds of things do happen. I mean, there's this competitive machinery that sometimes rolls into gear to, change some of the dynamics and try and, like I said, move things that work in the best direction for your company. Maybe try and slow down your competitors. That's, like I said, less common. But, if you look at the Hadoop ecosystem, for example, there's a few major vendors, and they're all trying to push things in a direction that makes sense for them.
Actually, it's probably pretty healthy that we're having these conversations about forking, if these talks are actually taking place and that people are having these discussions, because if they were all out in their own silos, not talking to each other, then I'd be even more worried. So, this conversation that's bubbled up is a good thing. I wish that it didn't always have to be triggered by Twitter 140 character tweets that get our attentions, but these things happen in open source communities, and there are competing products and projects and needs, and they have to get hashed out. So I think as I'm going to keep saying, this is a natural thing to happen at this juncture in any large open source project. And hopefully they can work it out and use OCI as a backboard or springboard to get the conversations rolling and push it forward.
Joe?
I'm just kind of curious as to what kind of role that Docker would play in a fully standardized environment. From their perspective, it seems like they could do the route. They could either go like the VMware route and basically take the ball and go home, and just try to build up their customer base as large as possible, or they could get like swept over like Netscape originally was with the browser, and just have the market standardize around them until they are basically rendered kind of irrelevant. So it'd be interesting to see going forward what role they would play in the future. That's kind of my interest in this.
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot of room to work around standards and still provide, a differentiating experience, differentiating product. The standard might apply to the format or to the runtime, but it probably doesn't apply to the user experience, right? It probably doesn't apply to what the CLI looks like, what any kind of GUI on top looks like. All those places, and Docker shined in the first place because it provided a great user experience around containers, and they'll continue to do so, right? I mean, that's one of their best qualities as a community, as a company, is knowing how to provide a great user experience. There's a lot of room to work around containers for everybody to, or around standards for containers, I should say, for everybody to go in a different direction and compete on top, whether that's competing, at the management layer, whether that's competing around experience, whether that's competing around a lot of different areas.
I think Docker's done some amazing things around the UI. You hit that nail on the head. I think that's one of their selling points for their product. I think they'll continue to do that. I think Swarm is still early days. We'll see how well that gets populated out there and gets used. But there's lots of ways that, and you should get Solomon on here to talk about it at a new Stack things.
Well, for the record, we did ask Docker if they would like to participate in this recording here. We also asked Google, Craig McCluskey, if he'd like to participate. Yeah, we have not yet heard back from him, but we're hoping to get those folks engaged pretty soon. I guess Diane, my last question is, you work on Docker on Red Hat products, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, has the Docker changes, affected your own product development? Are things breaking for you that you've been having to fix?
Well, as Dan Walsh mentioned in the blog post that you put out, we quoted him, we have our fork with our patches for the things that we need to make sure that the security and it works. And we maintain those so it really hasn't affected our release cycle or our product release cycle in any way for OpenShift, we are beholden to the Kubernetes release cycle as well as the Docker one, because we upstream both of them into our project. So, the engineers on my team might disagree with me, but I think that what we've done is figured out a way to accommodate it and move forward and continue to work with both the Kubernetes and Docker one effectively. So it hasn't, 3.3 is just about to come out of OpenShift. So there's a blog post with the early release. It hasn't slowed us down one iota. And I think the idea and the trust that people have in Red Hat to create stable releases of these tools and value adds on top of them shows, the value of open source.
Have your end customers been affected by Docker's changes?
Not yet.
Then why would this fork even be being discussed at this point then?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, from our perspective, I'm sure, and Dan Walsh alluded to it, there's some System D conflicts going on, choices at the low levels that need to be ironed out. So there's still a lot of discussion around that. And I think that the idea that we have to maintain some patches on our own probably irritates a few people. But, I've seen that on lots of other projects too. Right down to Linux and all kinds of other things we've worked on in the past. So, it's not a showstopper, but it just makes life a little painful on the release cycle, maintaining extra patches.
So Donnie, are you talk to customers, you talk to people who are developing products, are they frustrated? Are they not? Or, are they talking that they would like to see some fork, some change?
It's tough. And I guess when we talk to people and we do surveys at sort of large scale IT priorities and stuff, they're looking for, the answer to everything all the time all at once, right? So, you hear these conversations that have been going on out there in the industry about, mode 1 versus mode 2 or whatever. And
Right.
We're seeing something very different happening, which is people are, using automation to get both agility and lower risk at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
With, CI/CD, with, microservices architectures to lower the overall impact of any kind of failure point that happens. And so, that kind of dual approach of agility and risk management is the bigger picture. And so, I don't think there's necessarily a huge conflict between an agile release cycle and stable software, right? That's not like something that can't be reconciled. It's just something that's going to take more work to improve. Because you definitely don't want to be releasing half-baked software to your customers, no question about that, or to your partners for that matter. And so, it's something that can be fixed as, people better understand what's going on, build out the use cases. It is always challenging when you slip major new features into stable software. And there is always room to improve how you release new software. But, like I said, it's not an irreconcilable thing. It's something that I think if nothing else out of all these kinds of discussions, there's going to be, or there should be improvements in the release engineering process.
Certainly seems like it's not. It certainly seems to be something that could be reconciled. From sitting right here at my little desk here in Portland, Oregon. But I mean, there's a lot of human dynamics here. Job, any last thoughts or questions?
No. I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
Well, guys, thank you very much for taking some time. This is kind of a broad conversation, but as we all recognize, this is a discussion that's just kind of starting to develop, and so we look forward to keeping in touch with you guys and following it accordingly. So, thanks for your time, Donnie, Diane, Job. Thank you all for participating today.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Alex Williams, founder of THENEWSTACK, and you're listening to the Stack Analysts podcast, a show about application development and management at scale. Thanks for joining us.